Hey guys, first I want to thank you guys for coming to the last talk. Kind of what I want to talk about today is just something I stole from actually one of my old interns who now works at the Olympic Training Center. Performance through durability. To me, that's kind of what it's all about at this point in the game. The best ability you can have is availability or durability. If you have those two things, you got a shot. So this is just kind of some things I've done throughout my career and tweaks I've made and changes I've made to get to a point where I think I have a decent setup that maybe you guys could take something from. This is kind of my goal for this presentation for you guys. By no means am I an expert, any more than anybody that's sitting down, but I've always thought if I can go to a conference or a clinic and take one thing, it helps me out, So hopefully out of this presentation, you guys can take one thought that'll maybe help you kind of shift what you're doing or think about what you're doing and maybe just make some sense to it. This I think is a pretty big deal. The majority of deaths among college athletes, they occur under the direct supervision of a strength and conditioning coach. And that's a pretty staggering number, 20 deaths since 2000. So that right there shows that all of us have a responsibility to make sure that we're taking good care of the guys, the girls, the kids, however you want to say it, that we're training every day. This August, and I know it kind of got a little jammed up with what the certification was going to have to be, but this was the first year that it was required to have some type of national certification. So I think finally the field is kind of going in the direction of maybe these guys are smart, maybe they have an idea, we have a big responsibility to take control of. How do strength and conditioning coaches pretty much fit into the big picture? I just kind of threw out 5 points. Positive environment for student athletes to train. That's got to be number one. You don't want people walking in there into a crazy negative environment. Number two, how do you enhance the tangibles? Your work capacity, your strength, your speed, your acceleration, body comp, all those things that we can track, write down, have numbers, do all that stuff. And then finally, on this slide, how can we enhance the intangibles? Your work ethic, your lifestyle, so maybe some of those things up there go a little bit better. Your attention to detail, your professionalism. If you make your guys or your girls walk into the weight room every day wearing the same gear, they might travel that to their next job interview and say, hey, now I got to dress right when I go to work. And then, finally, peer accountability, which I think is one of the biggest things we can give anybody, is not just us holding them accountable, not just their sport coach, but how do they hold themselves accountable? Last two, and this I think is big. We got to prepare all these athletes for the next phase of what they have. So prepare them so they can get through your workouts. Prepare them so they can get through practice, and then prepare them for competitions. And I think a lot of times that is kind of lost, where you just think, hey, football is a 6-second game. I got to do 6-second drills because that's all they do when they play their games, and that's the average length of the play. That's not necessarily what we're training them for. We might be training them to make it through 30 straight days of double sessions in the summertime, And also, I think you got to make student athletes a better version of themselves. So when it comes down to it, everybody wants to have the team that can, bench 1 million pounds and squat 1 million pounds. But at the end of the day, it's get them from point A to point B and just make them a better version of the guy that got recruited. Here's the two categories that I really think affects how we feel as strength coaches. Number one, you're either an extension of the sports staff. And a lot of you guys or girls are probably on that, where you're on the football staff, you're on the basketball staff. It's a very different influence than the next one we're going to talk about. You're probably an extra coach. You probably answer directly to that sport coach. What you're doing day to day is probably heavily influenced by what your boss, the sport coach, wants. And then finally, your job security probably falls under the umbrella of that coach. So a lot of times that could give you kind of a skewed vision of what you're supposed to do. The second version is what I'm under at my university is you're part of a sports performance team. We're definitely in a situation at Delaware where we work in conjunction with our doctors, our athletic trainers, our equipment managers. We answer directly to our administration, where we sit down in different meetings and have group meetings. And, we're probably heavily influenced by what we're doing as a group. We still take goals, we still do different things, but more or less our vision is how can we make these people better? It's a little bit different setup. When you're on a sports performance team, I think it's a lot different. You have one specific goal. So our big thing is you want to get the team better, you want to get the individual better. On top of that, I think everybody's a leader and everyone's in charge of their area. So that right there might give you a little more juice or a little more thought process to kind of work through the workouts and work through your setup. Here's pretty much our 3 major questions that influence strength coaches when I was kind of taking down some feedback from different peers I have and different people on my staff. Are we preparing our athletes for the next phase of the year? That I think is a big deal. We sit here right now where I'm at, and we have a January term. We actually started on Monday. So our big thing is, all right, we got to get these guys ready so when all the coaches get off the road for football, they can make it through those conditioning stations. We have to definitely look and say, what's the next phase of the year? How are we using our winter program to prepare for spring ball? How are we using our summer program to prepare for camp? How are we using camp to prepare for the season? It has to be very, very segmented. So are we doing that, or are we just going all in and saying, I want to attack these guys, I want to get it going, I want to have the best workouts I can have? So that's something I think you got to definitely step back and think about. Number two, are we staffed, qualified properly to do the job? I think now with the certifications and the fact that we have different, legislation and stuff, I think that'll help us. But I think that's also a big deal where you might be sitting in an athletic department and you have 2 full-time coaches for 21 teams, or you have 5 coaches for 1 team. How are you staffed to do the job that's demanded by your superiors? And then finally, and this one's tough, how confident are you and how supportive are you to tell a sport coach, we can't do that, or that's a bad idea? Because a lot of times that can affect your job security, and it might affect the way you're programming and doing stuff. So that, I think, affects you on a day-to-day basis when you're looking at what you're doing. Another part, as we talk about durability is, what are major concerns athletic trainers and sports med have with all of us? And again, I polled a bunch of guys, I talked to people, I sent out some emails. Here's what they are. Too aggressive in programming to where people are getting hurt in the weight room. That's a legitimate concern athletic trainers have with strength coaches. Second one, not enough periodization in the preseason or in season. So how are you going about your sets and reps? How are you going about your volume when you start really ramping up practice and different types of things like that? Causing athletes to be too tired for practice. So if you're training before practice, how in tune are you with the major plan of what's going on? Or are you killing them in the weight room, or maybe overloading their legs where they can't go out and play basketball or volleyball or whatever the sport is? And then finally, when you get the injury reports from the trainers, how are you with modifying lifts? These are a lot of concerns that different trainers have with what we do. On the flip side, I know there's a lot of issues we have with athletic trainers because I've always had it throughout my career with different concerns and different thoughts that you have. Number one, and I think this is big, not allowing athletes to do certain movements. We have a lot of people at our school when I first got here that were, basically Pete Rosed, where career-wise you can never back squat again, you can never do this again, you can never do that again. And I think a lot of time that's closed-minded, where if you're approaching it the right way, you can obviously get athletes to do a lot of different things post-op, post-injury to get back to where they're at. Number two, holding them out because they don't want the sport coach to get on them. I know a lot of times I've had a time where, oh, hey, he's our best wide receiver, I don't want him to go real heavy in the weight room today, or that's our point guard, Ted, maybe put him on the bike today, we need him to play good. That's a big issue too, I think also you can have with certain stuff. Being overly cautious at critical times of the year. That also I think kills you. Why do we have to be so cautious at certain times of the year when we should just have faith in us to do the right thing? And then finally, I think this is a big deal with trainers. A lot of trainers I've seen don't have a great technique base when performing rehab. So I've always found it to be kind of comical where maybe we get attacked at times for someone getting injured in the weight room or, a different type of technique, and then you look over and you see an athletic trainer, and they might be having someone not squat properly, not lunge properly, and it all kind of ties in. So now they're getting released back into the program, and they have bad mechanics, and we have a bunch of other issues. So I think when you take all those things in, I was just kind of thinking about it, and I wanted this talk to be a little bit more about stuff I've seen, stuff I've went through, and kind of adjustments I've made along the way that has helped me kind of combat some of the problems that strength coaches have had with trainers, trainers with strength coaches, and trying to get it to be one common goal. So first thing, acclimation. This is something where whenever you get a different period of time, so coming off spring break, maybe not spring break's a good example, coming off winter break, coming off summer break, coming off an in-season program, anytime there's a lull, I think there's got to be an acclimation phase within our lifts. The NCAA has mandated it with practices in the summer, but not really with strength and conditioning. So we kind of created something that we call, our baseline assessment testing. We do this on the first week or the first day, and what we wanted to have was non-skilled evaluations where we could basically get a read at where our athletes are. And by non-skilled, I mean not a squat, not a bench, not a clean, Because to me, that's a lot of coaching and that's a lot of skill work. So basic things where we can get a read at where we're at. True comparisons. Any of you who have coached in a college setting know your juniors and seniors in the coach's eyes are drastically worse than the incoming freshmen when they show up. So just a true read of, hey, this is where the kid is when he's 18. This is where our juniors are. How do they compare on a line if we kind of put them next to each other? Year-to-year progression. Again, not skill work, because if a kid broke his wrist, he might not be able to clean or catch a clean or do anything like that. So true progression year to year. Progress versus coaching ability. I think a lot of times when we're assessing how are we Olympic lifting, how are we pressing, how are we squatting, it's how good of a coach and how good of a job we're doing with technique. So how can we judge that? And then finally, if we're talking about getting acclimated back into what we're going to do, how can we find, undisclosed issues from injuries that maybe weren't reported? So we basically came up with this. All right, here's 5 things that take no skill. What are your measurables? Your height, weight, your body comp. We want to track all that stuff as we go. We want to drastically change bodies. We want to cut down and have really good lean body mass. What's your joint range of motion? It doesn't have to be an FMS. We do the functional movement screen. Any screen you have that's going to really address joint range of motion. The next one, acceleration. How do your athletes accelerate? So again, we use a 10-yard dash on a laser. Our kind of thought process was, do we want people to run a 40 right off the bat and pull a hamstring? Probably not. So why not go with a 10-yard sprint? How's their lower body power? We do a standing broad jump for a couple of reasons. One, it's quicker. 2, you can't really cheat it. Where with the vert, people can figure out a way to cheat their reach. And I think it's just a really good test of horizontal power. And then finally, work capacity. We make every athlete, regardless of sport, run one 300-yard shuttle as fast as they can, and we track it. So our kind of thought was, when we come back and we see how our workouts are going, so if we're talking year-to-year progress, we get done with the whole year, we can sit back if we do the baseline at the end of the year and say, hey, do we have better joint range of motion? Now, it doesn't mean we sat there and practiced the FMS. It just means, are we squatting right? Are we lunging right? Are we doing good step-ups? How is our thoracic mobility? Do we have good joint range of motion? How are we accelerating? Are we using the proper things in the weight room to make sure we're accelerating right and we're running better? How's our power? And, are we in better shape? If we can kind of step back, take the skill work out of it, and look at those 5 things, I think it's a great way to say, how's your program going? Also, when you talk about acclimating someone in, very, very rare instance, someone's going to go down or get hurt in that day of training because it's not super taxing. So you can also kind of get a gauge at where they're at just by how they're running their shuttle. And then maybe you can say, all right, hey, we came back in killer shape compared to last year. We can ramp up our program, or, man, we're not looking too good. We might have to back off a little bit. The second thing we do in this week is we try to use a 90% checkpoint. So I've always been kind of in turmoil when I started of, you come back after Christmas break or you come back after the summer and let's test and see where we're at. So I've always, as I kind of got into it a little more, I was thinking, that's probably a really bad idea. Like you're having someone take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks off and then you're going to max them out. Or summertime, maybe they're coming back for camp or who knows. But I always thought, maybe that's not the way to go. So we kind of came up with, if you can lose 10% of your max, that's all we want to see. Are you within 10% of where you were when you left campus? So can you do your warm-up sets? Can we put 90% on the bar? Or can we kind of adjust it and maybe hit it 85% for 3 on day 1? If you're within 90% of where you were when you left, we don't change your max that you're going to work off. We say, hey, basic, physiology, you've been away from it a little bit. You might have had a bad day. You're within 10%. We can see where we're at. If a kid gets crushed, then we adjust their max. If a kid comes back and maybe hits that 90% for 2 or 3 reps or maybe more, maybe you adjust it up. But I've always been in the train of thought that I'd rather have their training max be a little less anyway. And if any of you guys have been familiar with the 5-3-1 or any system like that, you're kind of training off 90% as it is. So this has been a real easy way to stress technique, see where the athletes are at, and make sure no one gets hurt within the weight room. When we're talking about reintroducing running, this is also something that I think is very, very tough to grasp at times. And I had a lot of struggles with it where, what do you do when you get someone back? How are you going to get them back in shape without running him to the ground? How are you going to maybe you're not doing enough stuff. So we said, let's try to have a very heavily GPP-based foundation. So different things, med balls, ropes, foot ladders, which a lot of people think are taboo right now, different type of calisthenics stuff. Maybe have a 4-tiered warm-up where you got 4 stations of 4 minutes where you're hitting different things, track hurdles. And then you go into your form runs, and then you go into maybe some starts, and next thing you know, you have a 45-minute workout where you have people moving around, you're training different energy systems, and you're getting them back into the flow without risking pulling hamstrings, popping Achilles, doing all types of things if you started them off too hard. So that's something where I think when you're talking about reintroducing people back into your program, make sure you take that time to maybe use almost alternative stuff to get them going. The other things you can do, which I think helps you in that first week or first 2 weeks of the program is, basic stuff. You did your movement screen, so now you can reintroduce your warm-up. And by that, once you do your movement screen, you should have a cross-section of your team, so you have different type of corrective stuff you want to do. So, reintroduce the correctives, reintroduce how to properly do the Ys, the Ts, the holds, all different stuff like that. In the weight room, let's make sure, reintroduce the basics. Can you squat, can you hinge, can you press, can you pull? And it doesn't necessarily have to mean throw a bar on their back and back squat on first day. Grab a heavy weight and do a barbell RDL. Just kind of reintroduce proper squat mechanics, hinge mechanics, pushes and pulls. Proper range of motion. This I think is huge. You get someone who was on their own for 4 to 6 weeks, they might not be squatting to depth the way you wanted. They might not be coming all the way down on their pull-ups the way you wanted. There might be a lot of different issues you had where you can say, all right, we're going to do some iso holds, some stability work, some pausing at the bottom to make sure we got proper range of motion with a lighter load. And then finally, your tempo you can do also. So if you're someone who's a tempo guy with an eccentric and a pause, or we go off a clock, so minute 15 to do your set, pair it up with an exercise and come back. By using a body weight movement or a lesser load or maybe not a barbell, you can kind of build some more capacity within that part of your program, ensure you have good technique, and you're also getting them back into the tempos you want to get, so when they get to week 2 and 3, it's not a shock in how fast you want them to move throughout the training session. Programming, and this is something that, everybody in here programs. Everybody in here does a lot of different things. This is kind of like a broad stroke way of how we've kind of sat down and thought, what's our best way of programming, getting kids to buy in? This I think is huge. We call it the 4 No's of programming, and I don't even know where we got it from, but we've used it for the last 3 or 4 years. Number one, know your personnel. So before you even sit down and try to write the best program for Team X, know exactly who you're dealing with. And if you do that opening screen and that opening baseline testing, you should have a pretty good grasp at the group of kids you're going to deal with. So know exactly who you're dealing with personnel-wise. Number 2, know your facility. Everybody's going to come to this conference and see coaches from all over the country talk, and you might want to come back and take, this is what Ohio State or Ole Miss or USC does, but you don't have their facility. So know your facility as you're putting together your programming. Know your timetable, and this is a big one that we always struggled with, was you might have a team that's not super dedicated year-round. So the timetable you have, if you have 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 25 weeks, that should have a definite influence on the type of exercises that take a lot of skill and teaching that you're going to do. Because at the end of the day, you still have to prepare them in those tangible type of things that you're working on. And then finally, know your limitations as a coach and a staff. If you're not a great Olympic lifter, there's no need to do it. You can go learn, you can go figure it out, but you can throw med balls and jump boxes and do Vertimax drills and do a lot of different things to work on total body power. If you don't know exactly really well how to teach certain different methods in training, don't do them. Do what you're comfortable with. Get the athletes to buy in and run with it. You got to really trust what you're doing by being honest with yourself. So we've always kind of taken those 4 things and said, all right, who are the kids we're dealing with? What kind of lifters are they? What's their training age? What's their injury history? How do they come back? How's our facility look? What do we got? We got 40 kids in here. We're going to have to pair some stuff up when we're making these programs to keep a good flow. What's our timetable? We got 7 weeks. Let's work backwards. And then, lastly, what can I teach? What do I have enough staffing help to teach? And how can I make sure I got enough eyes on all the different athletes that are going through it to make sure it's a safe environment? This I think is a big deal. All the little things matter. Everything I think you guys do in the weight room matters. And I mean that to like a fault. Your warm-up, your strength portion, your finishers, every single part of it matters. So as I kind of go through how I set up the program, I really struggle at times with pairing exercises because I'm the type of guy where, and I was talking to it with a couple people last night, if we're going to squat and we're going to have to pair our squat with some type of corrective to prep for the next exercise, I have a tough time making sure that corrective is done properly. And I have an even tougher time trusting these athletes to do it right. So at the end of the day, if we're all caring about the squat and getting after them in the squat and they got to walk over and kind of prep for a bench press by doing some type of pull or a Y and a T, if they're not doing that properly, they're not really prepping themselves for the next exercise. So we kind of, if you guys have ever read the book, looked at the book, Eat the Frog First by Brian Tracy, it's all about needs and wants and prioritizing. So we kind of came up with this system that we just kind of used as far as making our templates and how to properly come up with, setting up a program for our athletes. So the first thing, if you read that book, is things you don't want to do, but you need to. So we just take the first 10 to 15 minutes of every workout and we say, all right, hey, 10 to 15 minutes, what do they need? We did our screens. We know where we're at. We know our kids. Can we do our activation stuff, our stability stuff, our mobility, our injury prevention? How can we get all that stuff done 10 to 15 minutes in a warm-up and coach it? So if we have 3 coaches out there, now we can really coach up proper scap work when we're doing Ys and Ts. Now we can coach up how to properly when we're doing lunge holds and squat holds and all different types of prime and prep work. We just do it first. Take 10 to 15 minutes, create your warm-up. We use kind of a 4-tier system where we want to do some type of stability, some type of dynamic movement, some type of CNS activation, and then some type of like what we call movement prep or direct prep for what we're going to do in the next phase of the lift. So we try to use those 4 areas and say 10 to 15 minutes, knock it out. They need it. They don't want to do it. We don't want to really coach it, but we know it's important. Knock it out in the first 10 to 15 minutes of the lift. Second part, things you want to do and actually need to. Like this is why everyone got into the field, into the job, right? Take that middle 40 to 45 minutes, do all your power work, your strength work, your assistance work. Basically train your athletes. Take that middle portion and say, all right, it's a lower body day. We're going to squat, we're going to hinge, we're going to do some type of lunge movement and coach it like crazy because you don't have to pair anything up with it. If you have a room where you have the potential to pair stuff up, just break your staff up where you can really focus on what you're doing. Take that 40 minutes. You want to train them in it. They need it and kill it. And then the last part, things you want to do, but you don't actually need to. This is where I think it really helps with the buy-in from your athletes. So more or less at this point, you come in and you say, all right, hey, what do we want to get them to do to walk out of here saying that was a great workout? We have a lot of guys in our basketball team or our football team where we'll do a gun circuit, we'll do a trap circuit, we'll do a lot of different core stuff or glute stuff for our female athletes. It might be overkill. They might not really need to do it. We'll do different competition finishers. But they walk out of that weight room feeling big, feeling jacked, having a great time. And you know what? They don't remember the beginning 10 to 15 minutes of all the corrective work we did. They might not even remember how much they hated doing 5 sets of 5 Bulgarian split squats. But they walk out of there saying, oh, that was a great workout. I'm going to get you next time. So again, get them to buy in. Get them to buy in however you want. And I think it's a pretty easy system to do from that aspect. Loading principles, if you're talking about programming, I truly believe this is something that's as important as it gets. If you have sound loading, you're going to have proper technique. I think a lot of the technique issues we have as coaches is we try to go too heavy. And I think it's everybody across the board. Secondly, I think if you overload them, you're going to have really, really bad technique. I think that's almost a fact. If you're going too high in the intensity paired with too high in the volume, your kids can't get through it properly and something's going to give, right? Either your technique's going to go or you're going to get hurt. It's one of 2 things. That's the only way you're going to ever miss a lift. You hope your technique goes and you dump it, but sometimes the opposite happens. And then I think the last part, which I think is paramount, if you have really good technique, you will eventually get stronger. And I think that sometimes is missed, where if you slow cook your athletes and you take a lot of time and you say, all right, we're going to make sure we can do X, whatever the exercise is, perfectly, eventually you're going to get stronger. You just got to take the time to make sure you have great technique and everything. This is something we utilize and something I studied a lot, and I think something that's been going on, obviously for years and years and years. If you see, USSR national team coach 27 world records in 10 years. I'm sure there was countless hours before that the guy put in, and he made all his charts and all of his sets and reps and all of his ideal volumes to train athletes. So we kind of took this chart and said, you know what? If this has been around for decades, it's probably pretty good. You know, like why reinvent the wheel? So let's look at this chart. Let's see how we can use it. Let's put it into like a real world type of atmosphere. So this is how we kind of use the chart during different phases of the year to control volume. And we really switched off throughout, I would say, the last 3 or 4 years. Rather than being so worried about what intensity we're using with the athletes, we wanted to say, all right, during different phases of the year, how do we control the volume to, you know, combat soreness and increase performance? And once we know what type of volume we want to use, then we can play with the intensities to get the results we want. So in-season training, you know, low end of the spectrum in volume, low end of the spectrum in the reps of the set. So take 65%. All right, if you go to Perlpin's chart, and the way I kind of interpret it is the optimal volume at that percentage is 24 reps. If you can work 24 reps to 65% through all of his studies and all of his gauges, that's the optimal amount of volume to get strength gains at that percentage. If you go over 30, you're going to elicit an overtraining response. And if you go under 18, it's just not enough to get better. So in season, take the low end of the chart, work it at a lower rep range so there's less trauma on your muscles. You're not working a failure. You're not working a fatigue, but you're still getting an amount of volume in that's going to elicit a training response. And if you kind of just look back at it and you think about intensities, 5 sets of 5 at 70% is way more taxing on your body than 5 sets of 2 at 80%. Again, 70% on that chart, that's at the high end. He's at 24% or 24 reps at the high end of that chart. Same deal with 80. 10 reps is the lowest amount he said to really elicit a training response. So you can kind of play with it throughout the year and say, hey, we want to go a little bit heavier today. We want to, you know, get the guys to work a little harder. Let's use the low end of the chart and kind of bump the intensities up. It shouldn't fatigue you guys too much because, again, you're kind of using research to battle that. You know, postseason training. What are your main goals? You know, probably gain some size, right? Probably, you know, reintroduce a lot of movements. Probably get some muscle patterns back down. So again, let's go on the high volume in the sets and the reps, and let's use a lower intensity. So it's almost an effect of, if I'm going to go with the same percentage, 65%, let's hit 30 reps. Let's go 6 sets of 5. Let's go 5 sets of 6. Let's say, hey, perfect technique on every single rep. Don't worry about the weight. That's, again, we're probably right at the edge of the amount of reps we should be doing for overtraining, but we're in postseason. We'll put on some size, and we'll kind of get going with that. You know, this, again, is great because you don't have to go to failure. You can use that chart. You can look at it and say, all right, if I want to build some hypertrophy and get a little bit bigger, I'm going to go on all the high ends of the volume. I'm going to use a low enough percentage where I can get my athletes to move properly and hit their depth and do everything perfectly. And I'm not going to really, you know, risk injury because we haven't trained real heavy in a while. You know, off season, which I think is a pretty cool thing you can do with the chart, is you can waive the volume. And this is something that we've done throughout the years that I think has really helped us is the total reps, the reps per set, depending on what you really want to work on. You know, we've done kind of a 4-lift rotation with main movements. So we want to work some hypertrophy. Let's go with high volume. Let's go with moderate intensity. You know, so let's work that 5x5 at 75%. You know, that's a tough workout when you're not really factoring in your warm-up sets. You do your 2 or 3 warm-ups. You put on your weight. You got to grind out 5x5 at a set percentage. Again, it shouldn't be so heavy where you can't get them, but it's heavy enough where you can get a lot of bang for your buck. You know, technique work. So again, we always sit there and think, workout 1, if we're going to do a lot of volume, we're going to get to workout 2, and we're going to kind of cut it in half. So we take the low end of the volume, and we kind of use about the same percentage, and you can work on technique. So now you can take that same 70%. If your guys are sore, you can go pause bench press. You can go box squat. You can go pause squat. You can really kind of refine their movement patterns by using more or less the same load, but affecting the volume to get a good training response. Max effort work. You know, again, just look at the chart. Optimal volume, right? So you want to walk in there and say, optimal volume 85%, 5x3. Great. Ride out 5x3. It's a fairly high intensity. If you want to have the athletes open up their last set and add a little weight, you can. But it's an easy way, again, to kind of monitor how much we're doing with not overloading them so we can, again, refine our technique. And then finally, the last part, would be a dynamic effort type of movement, which is use the optimal work, cut the reps really low down, which is kind of the Louis Simmons strategy. So 60%, low end is 18 reps. We're going to knock out sets of 3. Bang, there's your intensity. We want to go optimal volume. It's 24 reps, 8 by 3. That's exactly what he uses when he gets to his dynamic effort squat, dynamic effort bench. It's just the optimal volume at a low intensity. So you're going to get a great response volume-wise, but you can really work through a lot of sticking points and move the bar fast. So our kind of thought in the off season has always been, all right, if we're using a split routine, rather than going, different blocks throughout our periodization, let's just kind of vary how we're using that chart, vary how we're using our volume, and kind of undulate it throughout so it's not getting stale. We're hitting different things. We can use different bars on different days, and we can just kind of go off that percentage to kind of map out where we're at. Preseason training. So now you're talking about not necessarily camp or not necessarily like when you started practicing, but preseason. So summer, fall for basketball, different times of the year. Conditioning is probably a huge emphasis in this phase because, again, we're trying to get them ready for the next phase of the year, which is going to be their season, their camp, whatever it is. So at that point, if you use that chart again, I think a real easy way to look at it is moderate intensities at optimal rep ranges, and then supplement it with high intensity work at low rep ranges. So you can still keep your maximal strength up by hitting, some reps in the high 80s, low 90s at low reps. So again, 90% at the low end is about 2 reps. Optimal is about 4. High is about 10. Use those low rep ranges. Hit a couple reps at 90% one day. Use your moderate ranges. So 80%, 5 sets of 3, work right through that. So this is a great way, preseason training, keep your strength up, keep your technique up, don't overload your athletes, but you can kind of keep getting responses and different things throughout the levels. This is something that I think when you're talking about being durable, I think if you program wrong and you load wrong and you have bad technique in the weight room, I truly believe it leads to a lot of injuries in the running program. You don't want to make it so your mobility is getting worse in the weight room and then you can't run. You want to take your running and your lifting and have them coincide. A great way we've always thought of training your lower body is just use the phases of a sprint. So what's the first phase of a sprint? It's your start. What is that going to be in the weight room? A deadlift, a box squat, a squat, some type of double leg push where you're coming from a static position and you got to move the weight quickly. What's the second phase? Some type of hip extension, so your acceleration. All you're really doing is when you're accelerating is a series of hip extensions. So that would be your RDLs, your good mornings, all different type of hip extension motions. And then finally, top end speed. A lot of times you're running off one leg. So work on getting your stride length better with some lunges, Bulgarian squats, your step-ups. If you can take the weight room, properly load it, properly have great technique, and just kind of think about it simply, there you go. You can coincide and have a great running program. If you don't, I think you have a lot of issues in your running program from bad technique and bad programming. Bad programming in running programs causes catastrophic injuries. And this is where a lot of those 20 deaths since the year 2000 have happened. Not a lot happened in the weight room. A lot happened early on. Bad programming, getting kids back in. They're not ready to work. You do too much too soon, too hot of weather, and you have a lot of issues. So I think you got to really make sure you program the proper way. Secondly, every single energy system is always taxed, and you guys know that. So regardless of the activity you're doing, every energy system is going to be taxed. And then lastly, work capacity is a full necessity. You always got to make sure you're in great shape. So I think as you go through everything and you look at how you're doing your running program, how are you going to start it off? We like to start off, keep the distances and the reps at the low end. So a lot of times when we first started off, we said, all right, here's what we're going to do. Let's bring them in here and we'll run some 800s or some 400s and do like a base level, track workout to get them better. And then people are dying and falling out, and it was bad. So now it's, why not come in and do some tempos? Maybe start off doing 1050s, 1060s, and kind of add reps to that. Again, you're not going to pull anything. You're not going to get hurt. You're going to have to build up your base level of conditioning, and you're going to create some work capacity. Secondly, as you're talking about getting people back into the workouts early on is, control the sprint mechanics early. There's nothing worse than you come back from a break or you come back from a different time of the year and you pull 2 hamstrings in workouts. So early on, you can build work capacity by really focusing in and repping form runs. If you have your guys or your girls lined up and you're doing ace skips, great technique, violently working on your turnover, you do 4 to 6 reps at 15 yards, it's going to build some work capacity. You do controlled high knees where they can't pass a coach 6 seconds for 10 yards, you're going to build some work capacity. You can work on sprint mechanics, kind of acclimate them into their training and not risk an injury, and you're still building a foundation for them to keep going throughout the training. Simple to complex movements, and I think this is something too that's huge, is make sure you're going real simple. So break everything down early on. Take your sprint mechanics into account. Take into all of your linear work before your change of direction work. When you're talking about your energy systems, work the shorter bursts, then get a little bit longer, and then get more specific to your sport. So again, acclimate them for the longer work. Once they're in great shape, get specific. Don't kind of jump the gun and flip them because you're not going to have a lot of success as you get moving. When we talk about work to rest ratios, and I think this is pretty big as far as programming different types of running workouts. We want to start all of our sessions on the high ends of those work to rest ratios. And you can definitely do that by 1, planning it out, 2, grouping your athletes together. But if you look at just something really basic and you're saying, all right, anaerobic power, right? I want to work anywhere from 0 seconds to 10 seconds, all right? Why not get a 30-second rest if you do a 3-second rep? Why not get a 45-second rest if you get a 3-second rep? So the easiest way to do that is pair your athletes up in groups of 5 or 6, run them through it, time your rest, make sure they're getting at the proper work-to-rest ratios so they can give you that proper power output. Again, if we're working in the next energy system, 60-second reps, make sure you're giving them enough rest. And again, it's tough at times when you have a sport coach that says, I don't want them standing around, I'm going to do different stuff. So if you can kind of line them up differently or set them up in different areas, make sure you're really working on proper work-to-rest ratios with that stuff. And finally, if you're going to do a longer type of run, you don't have to give them as much rest because obviously it's not as fatiguing overall on your body. So maybe you do a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2, and you can kind of work your athletes through that by just pairing them up. So really make sure early on when you're programming, if you can focus on timing all your reps, working on proper work-to-rest ratios, different stuff in that, I think it's going to help you out immensely. Agility training, and this is always a hot topic, and you always see on YouTube when you post videos, and I think at some times nowadays you have so much time that the sport coaches can now take their athletes back. So individual workouts, individual practices, 2-on-2 with coaches. If you have teams that are doing a lot of that stuff, I don't know if you have to do a ton of change of direction work. I don't know if you have to get your basketball team in there anymore and do a lot of different change of direction work once they start individuals. I think a lot of times you can do that and it leads to a lot of overuse injuries. So I think, again, getting with your sport coaches, talking to them, kind of sitting down, figuring out what you want to do, I think that will make a big difference where if we're at a period or time of the year where we have a lot of different individuals, we have a lot of different practices, maybe we're going to work on baseline conditioning, linear speed, all types of different work capacity stuff where we're not going to beat up their ankles, their knees, their hips, different stuff to that. I think at the end of the day, athletes and coaches really need a conditioning base, they need work capacity, and they need great attention to detail. So those are all things you can work on within your training sessions and maybe not beat them up, maybe keep them a little bit more durable. The third thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this speech, guys, was just reintegration. So many times you get an athlete who's hurt, and there's been a lot of talks on that, where athletes are hurt, how do you get them back into the program? This is something that we've had great success with. Stability before mobility. So we basically have said, if you're injured and you come in, we got to make sure you're properly holding all different types of isometric movements before you can get back into doing stuff where you're moving around. We also want to make sure, let's use a lot of body weight exercises before we go into our resistance training. Here's a simple, I guess, format more or less where your athletes, okay, someone got hurt, someone has to get reintegrated back into squatting. Here's an easy plan. Can they do an isometric hold? You hope they can. If they can do an isometric hold, great. Let's move on from there. Can they do a goblet squat to a box? Awesome. Get them to do that goblet squat. Take the box out, get them to front squat, get them to back squat to a box, and then get them to free back squat. You can take that time throughout 3 to 4 weeks 3 to 4 workouts, however long it takes, and get them back into your program with great technique and prevent a couple injuries. This is something I suggest that kind of you make for your own program. So we kind of put together what we call a regression progression chart. The middle column right there is perfect world, all right? If we have our athletes come in, what would be a great workout for them? Total body power. Can we power clean from the floor? All right? What's our main indicator going to be if we're talking lower body strength, front squat? What's our main indicator going to be if we're talking upper body pressing, a bench press? Our main hip hinge is a bar RDL, and our main upper body pull is a pull-up. You can even add in a single leg and say maybe a barbell lunge. So we basically looked there and said, all right, hey, that's where we want to get. That's where we love our athletes to be. That's our ideal world. How are we going to get to a power clean? All right? Let's teach our athletes how to tall clean. Can they set up nice and high? Can we teach them how to jump, shrug, punch their elbows, and catch it without really using their legs, focusing on cycling their elbows through, having really a great starting and finishing position? Once they can get to that, all right, let's lower it down a little bit. Now we can teach them to hang clean. Once we can get them to hang clean, now we can bring them to the floor, show them the starting position to the power clean. So our whole thought method with that was, we're not even going to touch the power clean from the floor until we can, 1, have them start and finish the lift well, 2, really master, and I say that in quotations, the second pull, and 3, how are they going to be with the starting position from the floor? So you might, in essence, never get to the power clean. You might just get to a point where you're like, you know what, my athletes are going to hang clean all the time. We're not great from the floor. That's fine. You're still hitting total body power. Now what happens once you can power clean, all right? Once we can power clean, now we can progress to different types of combos. So do an RDL, do a hang clean, do a front squat. Now once we can do that, we can progress to a full clean from a hang, where we're letting athletes pop, drop, and catch it in a full squat. And then finally, once they've kind of mastered those 6 movements, now we can full clean them from the floor. It was almost mind-boggling to us that a lot of times you're making workouts and you're almost going to, step 6 before you do step 2. So our big thing was, let's make this chart for our main movements. We go to front squat, same deal. That's our main indicator we use in the weight room for a number of reasons. I'm a true believer that, 1, if you're going to Olympic lift, you got to be a great front squatter. Because I think at the end of the day, you want your athletes to go under the bar. You don't want them to widen out. You got to be a great front squatter. 2, it's a true squat. Your torso's up. You really can force pushing your knees out. It's hard to not get to depth if you're working on technique. And at the end of the day, front squat is a pretty tough exercise to do, so it does build some type of mental toughness within your athletes. So we said, all right, we want our athletes to front squat. How are we going to get them there? Same deal. Spend some time teaching the proper position with an iso hold. Spend some time getting them to push their knees out. Spend some time making sure that your form is dictating your depth, and your depth isn't dictating your form. So everybody wants to stress your depth, your depth, your depth. Teach them how to get there. Teach them how to get to the spot, hold it. Secondly, front load them with a kettlebell. Teach them how to goblet squat. Finally, put a box there. Teach them how to rack it. Have them squat to a box, find it, get a pause, and then bang, then you can front squat. Once all of our athletes master the front squat, we can then go and get to our back squat to a box. So same deal. Don't just throw the bar on their back, have them bury it. You're going to have them fold over. You could have all types of different issues. Teach them on a box. Find the box, pause, squeeze your abs, engage your core. Once they get good at that, take that box out. Once you're good at that, maybe add some chains, add some bands, add a safety bar. Whatever you want to do, if you just take those 7 steps, you could have potentially 3 to 4 weeks of workouts, maybe even more, before you get to using a safety bar. On the flip side, you might never make it past front squat, but who cares? Because it's a great indicator, it's a great exercise, and to me, a squat is still a squat. As you go to pressing, so upper body, same idea. Everybody wants the bench press, right? Every kid has bench pressed since they were a little kid. I know I used to bench press in my basement at my house probably 4 times a week when I was in high school. Not always the best thing you can do. But again, college setting, team setting, take your time, slow cook them. So we want to make sure all of our athletes can do perfect push-ups on commands. Pause them at different points, have them do them on a bar, have them do them on dumbbells, all types of different push-up variations. Once we can really do quality push-ups, then we can get to using dumbbells. So again, a little more stabilizing, a little bit easier, a little bit less pride for male athletes. If you can get them to dumbbell bench right, make sure they can do that. Then we floor press them. I've always found that the floor press is a great corrector for a lot of different issues with shoulders. It teaches you, one, to pull the bar down, and if you pause it on the ground, you have to make sure the bar is even, because if not, you're going to hit different angles. And also, it teaches you to really get up on your shoulder blades because you're on a flat surface. So you can work the setup position from the waist up, and you can also work on properly eccentrically pulling the bar down. Once we do those three, and again, that could be one day. You know, that could be our acclimation day back with football, push-ups on a clock, dumbbell bench. Hey, we're in week 2, we're going to floor press. Great job. Now we're back to bench. We reinforced everything. Then we bench. After we bench, then we can move it on to our other stuff. So then we can do incline. You know, and I've always thought, you know, incline to me is a variation of the bench press that is more complicated. You got to hit it higher on your chest. You got to factor in the incline of the bench. You got to push it straight up to the ceiling, which is very different with bench, where you're pushing it straight up to the ceiling because you're on that curve, and a lot of athletes can't understand it. So once you kind of master, hey, here's we're pushing the bench press straight up to the ceiling, they might kind of click a little bit better. All right, the bar is going straight up and down. It doesn't necessarily come straight off my chest. So then we can work on hitting some incline, and then finally, you know, putting in Swiss bars, putting in chains, putting in bands, you know, all types of stuff with that. You know, the last two are kind of simple, but I think RDL is very important. You know, I think hinging might be more important than anything nowadays, because you really want to make sure you can activate your glutes. And for us, glutes, hamstrings, posterior chain is a big deal because we do use the front squatter as an evaluator. So our bar RDL is a main movement for us. We want to make sure that we're really, really good at hinging, we're really, really good at RDLing, and that's going to kind of carry over into everything we do Olympic-wise. So we set in and we teach it with a band to start. Everybody's coming in, throwing a band on their shoulders. Tall guys might grab it by the side. You know, there's absolutely no eccentric portion of the lift. How do you hinge? Can you push your butt back? Great job, stand up. We will rep a good morning for the whole first week, day, whatever you want to say, as our hip hinge. After that, same thing with dumbbells. Less humbling. Have guys grab 50s, 55s, whatever it is. Don't have to overload it. Once we're good at that, you're back to your RDL, and then if you want to progress and put on your shoulders, do some type of good morning, great. But again, we just really don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And then the same thing with pull-ups. You know, can you pull horizontally? Can you hold the pull-up for 5 to 10 seconds at the top? Then can you go to commands with your pull-ups? And then finally add some weight. You know, our big thing with this chart, which I think is a really big help to anyone and was to us, is one, you don't want to get ahead of yourself. And two, if you're making your program and you're kind of sitting there, a lot of times people say, hey, don't train muscles, train movements. All right, well, take it a step further. Don't train movements, train categories. Total body power, right? Say this is a total body day. Total body power. I have kids who are not a great training age. Hey, let's get in here. We just started Olympic lifting. Let's tall clean them. All right, we'll go 5 sets of 3. We'll coach them up. We'll get them going. Second thing, lower body push. We have really good squatters. We spent a lot of time this fall teaching the squat. We're gonna back squat to a box. All right, so we're on step 1 over here. We're on step 4 over there. You know, bench press. Where are we at with bench? We're okay. We had a couple shoulder issues. Maybe we didn't press hard during the season. All right, cool. Let's go to dumbbell bench. Let's kind of progress them into where we want to be. Let's get our hip hinge in. We'll go dumbbell RDLs. And then for our upper body pull, we can do something horizontal. We'll go with inverted rows. So you can kind of pick and choose within your workout, with almost in your exercise, regression, progression, where your athletes are at, not necessarily for that time of the year or that time of their training age, but almost more specifically for those exercises. Also, if you have athletes that come in pairs or come in sporadically throughout the day, or maybe you have a huge weight room where you want to have different type of programs, very easy setup to just look at and say, all right, hey, here's our young guys. They're going to do, you know, these variations in the progression. Here's our older guys. They might do it over there. So I think making this type of chart for what you do will immensely help you out, having it on paper rather than just kind of going through and thinking about it. You know, conditioning and movement training. You know, this is another thing that I think in programming, if you want to look at, you know, I'm a big person when you're reintegrating people back into a workout. Someone got hurt, it's early on. You know, don't be afraid to use some type of steady state cardio. And I know a lot of times people look at that like it's the devil, but it's not necessarily bad if you just came off a playoff run and maybe you have your athletes right back in there to say, hey, we got 10 or 12 spin bikes, throw them on the bike for 20 minutes. Maybe do some different interval stuff, but let's just get 20 minutes of a base foundation. I know when I worked at the Olympic Training Center with Mike, we would do that with the wrestlers all the time. We would do it with the volleyball players all the time. They came back off a tournament. They came back after a long break. What are they going to do for conditioning? It doesn't matter. Let's just get them in there, get their heart rate up, get them moving a little bit. It's day one. So I think that's something that don't ever be afraid to throw that in there. Number two, don't ever be afraid to just use really non-specific general things. You can take out your basketball team and do ropes for 10 minutes, and you can get a great workout and not beat up their knees, not beat up their ankles. Supplement that with maybe an upper or lower body lift where you're not taxing it so they can still go play. So kind of use that early on when you're getting them back in there. With conditioning also, I think it's really important as you're reintegrating your athletes, take your time. So get in there, take your time within your workouts, plan it out. If you have 12 weeks or 8 weeks, say, hey, this is where we want to get. Let's systematically get there and let's not rush. There's nothing worse than peaking out week 7 or week 8, and next thing you know, you have 4 more weeks and you have a bunch of people who are tired, who are burnt out mentally, who have hamstring issues, so really take your time on it. And then I think this is also very important. Get good moving linear before you progress to multi-directional. Spend a good amount of time to make sure we have good mechanics and we can really run, and then once you can run forward, once you have good conditioning going forward, then kind of break it up. Get some cutting in there, get some different stuff moving. Lastly, then I'd love to hear some questions from you guys. I think this is pretty important. It's not always what you emphasize, it's what you allow. So as you're kind of going through what you're programming, every time you want to have the perfect program. Every time you want to have the perfect group of athletes where you sit there and we're gonna make sure we're working on, a lot of power this phase or a lot of hypertrophy this phase. And you're so worried about what your program is. You're so worried about your sets and reps. You're so worried about your intensities that you're allowing bad technique, or you're allowing them to not touch lines properly. You're allowing them not to do stuff with an attention to detail base. I think this is one of the biggest things that you got to do as a coach. Do not allow bad habits. Do not allow people to do stuff wrong. And whatever you're going to emphasize and whatever you're going to have them do, make sure they do it. So regardless of what you're preaching, you got to follow through on the back end with it. Here's kind of my contact issue, guys. Facebook, if you want to follow us at Delaware Strength and Conditioning. Twitter at Coach Perlak. I'd love to take some of your guys' questions or kind of hear what you guys do, because I know we got a smaller group. So anyone have anything they'd like to ask or add or anything to that capacity? Nothing?
How does your sport performance model change over your career?
He said, how did the sport performance model change over your career? I would say the biggest thing was planning, really stepping back and planning your program. So everything from, how do you show up? What are we going to do the first day to what are we going to do the last day? I think that technique has been a big deal with us. And I think really utilizing the Prelpin's chart has made a big deal and had a really big input on how we're going to program, how we can keep our technique, and how we can still get stronger. That chart at times, if you look at it, it seems kind of boring. It seems like the intensities aren't super high. It seems like the workouts are easy. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you have athletes coming in, hitting that percentage for a set amount of reps, and doing a great job with it, having great technique, and then getting better throughout the weeks. You don't have to have every workout be a grinder, a killer, a beating. So I think really stepping back and saying, all right, let's take someone else's word for it. Let's take someone else's advice. Let's look at what's kind of stood the test of time. Trusting it, implementing it, that's made a big difference for us. The other thing, too, I think has been, for our model, is kind of like listening to the feedback of how our athletes are moving. When we do a lot of our program, when we do a lot of our strength training movements, or we do a lot of anything, going back to, at the end of the year, how's their movement screen now? Do they have a better movement screen? Because that means we had pretty good joint range of motion. Going back and saying, hey, we did a ton of speed work. Are they faster? Going back saying, hey, how was their broad jump? All that stuff that we talked about early, that made a huge difference for us, because now it was real. It wasn't just, hey, this team was great. Look at their squat numbers, look at their clean numbers, look at their bench numbers, because we taught them how to do those lifts. It was, all right, day one, when we didn't train them, this is where they were at. This is where they're at, day 200. Are they better? Did what we do make them a better athlete, make them perform better? So I think those things definitely have helped us out throughout the way. Anybody else? Awesome. Thank you, guys.